Okay, so, we're diving into some material today from the National Institute of Justice, and
Right.
it's all about wrongful convictions,
Yeah.
which is, a pretty heavy topic.
Definitely a crucial one.
And it just sort of begs the question, like, what does the NIJ actually consider
Yeah.
a wrongful conviction?
Right.
What are they
Right.
looking at? And how does post-conviction DNA testing, kind of fit into all of this?
It's huge, right? I mean, the fact that there's this whole section on the NIJ website dedicated to this
Right.
speaks volumes about just how important it is to get it right.
Right. Absolutely.
When we talk about just legal system, the idea of somebody being wrongly convicted it's a big deal.
So let's get into, what the NIJ
Okay.
actually considers a wrongful conviction.
Yeah.
They basically give us two core reasons that a conviction can be considered wrongful. The first one, and this is, I think, really the most troubling, is when the person who was convicted is actually innocent of the crime
Exactly.
that they were found guilty of.
This is about factual innocence.
Yeah.
The legal process concluded with a guilty verdict.
Right.
But the truth of the matter is, this person didn't actually commit the crime.
It's a huge error.
It's a profound error.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the second reason that they give is something they call procedural errors.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where someone's rights within the system were violated in some way during the process.
Absolutely.
Leading up to a conviction.
And these are incredibly important, too.
Yeah.
Even if somebody did commit the crime,
Right.
if their rights are violated, that really undermines the legitimacy of the whole process.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, looking at the materials you sent me, it seems like our focus today is going to be more on that first category.
Yeah.
That factual innocence. And the really, kind of surprising impact that DNA testing advancements have had in helping to reveal these cases.
Well, because when we're talking about proving, factual innocence after the fact.
After a conviction, right?
The NIJ really highlights the power of post-conviction DNA testing.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, this incredible scientific tool that we now have to go back and revisit these cases, particularly from, what they call the pre-DNA era.
Right.
Before this kind of technology was...
Before it was widely available.
Readily available.
Yeah.
It's given us like a whole new lens to look back through.
It's amazing how the technology has evolved.
Yeah.
You think about evidence that might have been collected decades ago.
Right.
And maybe it wasn't even tested then, or
the
tests that were available weren't that sophisticated.
Right.
But now we can go back to that same evidence with these new advancements and really potentially uncover definitive proof of innocence.
Yeah. And the NIJ specifically points out the improvements in DNA analysis, that have really made a difference.
Yeah.
They talk about being able to analyze evidence that's aged or degraded or that's, in very limited quantities.
Right.
Or even compromised in other ways.
Yeah.
And that feels like
it's huge.
Like a big breakthrough.
Imagine trying to get a clear picture from like a blurry old photograph.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So older DNA techniques were kind of like those early cameras.
Mm-hmm.
You needed a really big sample.
Yeah.
And it had to be pretty intact to get a reliable result.
Right.
But these advancements are like moving to, high-resolution imaging.
Mm-hmm.
Now, even with a tiny sample or one that's damaged, we can often extract enough information to get a clear and accurate profile.
Right.
And this has just opened up so many possibilities for re-examining cases that were previously thought to be unsolvable, through DNA testing.
It really makes you think about those cases where maybe evidence was tested, but it came back inconclusive.
Right.
Right. And now, years later, that same evidence could
tell a very different story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one thing that the NIJ provides is this section called Articles Published by NIJ.
Okay.
And there's a few titles here that really stand out.
Uh-huh.
The impact of false or misleading forensic evidence on wrongful convictions.
Right.
Exonerations resulting from NIJ post-conviction DNA testing funding, and simply post-conviction DNA testing.
Gotcha.
And, it's really striking to me how much they emphasize the potential failures of forensic science itself as a driver of wrongful convictions.
It's not always about a lack of evidence. Sometimes it's the evidence itself that's leading to the wrong conclusion. It could be limitations in the older techniques or even just misinterpretation of the results. And I think the NIJ's focus on this is really important.
Yeah.
It highlights the need for constant evaluation and improvement within forensic science.
Absolutely.
And then that article about exonerations resulting from their funding.
Right.
It really shows you the tangible outcomes.
Yeah.
You know, real people being freed.
Right.
Thanks to these advancements and the NIJ's support.
It really highlights how science, you know, when it's rigorously applied and constantly refined, can really be like a safeguard within the system.
Absolutely.
They also list events and trainings.
Okay.
And there's one in particular that got my eye, wrongful convictions. The latest scientific research and implications for law enforcement.
Interesting.
And that suggests that, you know, they're not just researching this in isolation.
Yeah.
They're really working to share this knowledge with people on the front lines.
That's really important. Awareness and education are powerful tools in preventing wrongful conviction.
Right. And by keeping, you know, law enforcement up to date on the latest science.
Exactly.
The NIJ is really taking a proactive stance.
Yeah. This kind of engagement is essential for translating research into actual change.
Yeah.
In how investigations are done and how cases are handled.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they also have this section on publications and grant reports.
Okay.
And we see some familiar titles here. You know, reinforcing their key areas of focus.
Yeah.
Wrongful convictions, the literature, the issues, and the unheard voices.
Right.
And again, the impact of false or misleading forensic evidence on wrongful convictions.
Okay.
It really drives home the idea that they're tackling this from multiple angles.
Yeah.
Not just through science, but also through examining existing knowledge and giving a platform to the stories of those who've been wrongly convicted.
I think including the unheard voices is so important. It reminds us that these aren't just statistics. These are real people whose lives have been profoundly impacted.
Yeah.
And by focusing on those personal stories, the NIJ, I think, adds a layer of empathy and urgency to the issue.
Right. And it's not all just, you know, qualitative.
Right.
They also have this statistics section.
Okay.
And while they don't actually present the numbers themselves, they point to other sites for that information. But I think the fact that they highlight the importance of data in understanding this issue is really significant.
You can't address a problem if you can't measure it.
Exactly.
Right.
And by pointing researchers and policymakers to these statistics, they're encouraging, you know, this data-driven approach to understanding, you know, the scope of the problem.
This allows for more targeted solutions and better assessment of, you know, whether we're making progress over time.
And finally, they have this initiative called Just Wrong, the Aftermath of Wrongful Convictions.
Right.
And this really kind of...
It puts it all in perspective.
Yeah, it brings the whole picture into focus, right?
It emphasizes that it's not just about, you know, identifying a wrongful conviction and getting an exoneration. That's just the beginning.
Right.
There's this whole other chapter dealing with the immense challenges faced by those individuals as they try to rebuild their lives after, you know, years of injustice.
It's a critical point that's often overlooked.
Yeah, exoneration is really just the first step in a long and difficult process.
Absolutely.
Of reintegration into society.
Yeah.
And individuals who have been wrongly incarcerated face all sorts of hurdles. Emotional and psychological recovery, finding housing, employment, reestablishing relationships, a lot.
And the NIJ acknowledging this aftermath, I think, shows a really comprehensive understanding of the impact.
The true impact.
Of his convictions.
Yeah.
So, you know, to sum it up for our listener, based on this information from the NIJ, a wrongful conviction isn't just about factual innocence.
Right.
Although that's certainly a key part of it.
Yeah.
It also includes convictions where there were major procedural errors that violated someone's rights.
Right.
But what's really compelling from all these sources is how advancements in post-conviction DNA testing have become this incredibly powerful tool for uncovering these cases of factual innocence, particularly by allowing us to re-examine evidence with much greater precision than was previously possible.
You know, I think the NIJ's work, as we've seen, through all these resources they provide, the articles, educational events, the publications, this focus on both data and the human experience, it really showcases a deep commitment to tackling this complex issue of wrongful convictions. They're not just studying the problem. They're actively trying to figure out why it happens, who it affects, and ultimately how to contribute to a more accurate and just legal system.
It makes me think, considering all this progress we've seen in forensic science, particularly with DNA. What are the challenges that remain in guaranteeing both the accuracy and the fairness of our justice system? It feels like, you know, while science offers these incredible tools, there's still, you know, the complexities of human interpretation, legal processes, the sheer volume of cases.
The volume of cases is huge.
You know, it means that there's still a long way to go in making sure that these errors are minimized.
Absolutely.
It definitely makes you think about the ongoing vigilance that's required.
It's a constant process.
Absolutely.
Of improvement and reevaluation.
I think that's a great point to end on.
Okay.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
Of course, my pleasure.
And we'll catch you next time.
Sounds good.